Hi, welcome to Senior Moments Successful Aging. I'm Mary Beals-Luedtka, your host. I'm the NACOG Area Agency on Aging Director, and you can reach us toll-free at 877-521-3500. Senior Moment Successful Aging is co-sponsored with Yavapai College Division of Lifelong Learning. Our co-producers are Connie Vargas and Allie Bateman. You can reach Connie at 928-717-7755, and you can reach Allie Bateman at that toll-free number, 877-521-3500. We would love to hear from you. So today I'm going to welcome a fellow NACOG staff person. Hey, Todd, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm good. So Tod Morris is joining us today. He is the NACOG Mobility Planner. So we're going to talk about what mobility planner means first, and then we're going to dive into some other stuff. Because sometimes people think, is that going to help me walk around, or what is a mobility planner?
Sure, and I think it can really take a lot of different forms. My position is kind of specifically oriented towards public transportation.
Yeah.
And so, pedestrian and other kind of walkway type initiatives. In some states that would be a part of the job description, but here I'm really focused on just public transportation.
And we're lucky to have you in our offices at the area agency on aging.
Enjoy being there.
Yeah.
Enjoy being there.
So we have a great collaboration. So where do you come from, Todd?
So I'm originally from, that's a good question. So I'm originally from Silverton, Colorado, which is a tiny town, 300 people at nearly 10,000 elevation.
I know exactly where it is.
Yeah. So I grew up there. My dad was a miner, and then we kind of traveled in and around the Intermountain West for a while. So I was living in New Mexico. I lived up in Montana, and then ultimately I ended up back in Durango near Silverton to graduate high school. And then since then, I went back to Montana to go get my undergraduate degree at Montana State, and then got a master's at Boise State. And then about a year and a half ago, I came from Boise to NACOG, and happy to be back in the Southwest.
And you worked in mobility management in Idaho, didn't you?
Yes, I worked for a public transportation entity out of Boise, doing really similar work as I am here. But it was nice working in Boise, where I kind of saw more of a urban, side of things. Boise's a big city for Idaho. And so it's really great to be able to come back and now focus on rural areas. So it's kind of, diversifies the type of work I'm doing.
So growing up in Colorado, did you have a lot of brothers and sisters?
I had a sister, and it's funny, my sister is actually probably in part the reason I ended up back in NACOG. So she is a whitewater rafting guide on the Grand Canyon.
Ah.
And so 2 falls ago, my girlfriend and I came down and we went on a Grand Canyon trip with her. And so we were kind of staying in and out of Flagstaff. And after the Grand Canyon trip, we kind of were just, fell back in love with the Southwest. And we're hanging out in Flagstaff, and we kind of talked about, well, what would it look like living in Flagstaff? Went home that night when we flew back to Boise, and I just Googled mobility manager Flagstaff, and this job description came up, and so that's how I got from Boise to here.
Meant to be.
I guess so, yeah.
Oh yeah, I think so. So you've been with us for, like you said, a year and a half.
Yeah, just about.
So you how did you get involved in public transportation in the first place?
So when I was in my undergraduate at Montana State, I got a degree in human geography, which is kind of a really loose degree. But a part of that program, I was actually able to travel abroad, where I went to China and spent 3 weeks in China, kind of exploring the different cities, and they all kind of had a human geography flair to it. But I really started getting interested in kind of transportation planning and looking at these huge cities like Shanghai and Beijing, and how all these people moving around. And so that's kind of where I found planted the idea of, maybe urban planning, transportation planning is something I would like to pursue. So immediately after that, jumped into grad school in urban planning. And initially, I guess almost immediately, I started to see, well, public transportation really is kind of the niche for me, I think, in this. I really like working with people. Definitely appreciate a lot of the benefits public transportation has to kind of helping people access opportunities. And so that was a pretty cool thing, and I was pretty excited about that while I was in grad school. And so I really kind of dug into the curriculum whenever it was talking about public transportation, and then ended up getting an internship at Valley Regional Transit in Boise, and then I was kind of cemented, I guess.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, yeah, and it's important that we get from one place to another, but yeah, how different is it out in the wild, wild west than it is in a city?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. It's actually something I really appreciated from when I was studying my master's at Boise State. Is they really focused on Intermountain West planning.
Oh, okay.
Because recognizing that it's so much different than if you were to go to the East Coast or even the West Coast, and that you have these wide open spaces, you have more rural areas, and you have these areas that people are wanting to move to because of the natural beauty, and in a lot of places it's more affordable. And so it's kind of just a little bit different. So people come from these communities on the East Coast or Midwest, and they get out to the Intermountain West, and they start recognizing, well, shoot, the same amenities that I used to have aren't quite. There's kind of a trade-off there that a lot of people, I think, kind of hits them once they actually get out here, especially for some of the senior population.
So you name, what are the challenges is we have wide open spaces? What are some of the challenges that we have in our region?
I think that, well, specifically to the state of Arizona, when it comes to public transportation, Arizona is one of 5 states that doesn't have a dedicated pool of funding to support public transportation initiatives. And so, that's inherently a challenge. And that's a challenge, across the board, across the nation right now, is just lack of funding to support these initiatives. But I think Arizona is unique in that, it's kind of in that limited group of states that don't have that additional support. And then that coupled with, the long distances between locations and just kind of the rural nature in general, I think that there's a lot of attitudes about, public transportation is for Phoenix, public transportation is for Tucson, kind of recognizing that these small areas, it's just such a foreign thing to them.
And I kind of, do you get the attitude sometimes in the rural areas that, that people don't want to ride with strangers?
I think there's a little bit of that. I think it's night and day from driving alone in your car, right? Driving alone in your car, you're kind of completely in control. I mean, lack of a better word, you could say you're isolated. Some could say you kind of have that private feel, but you're very much isolated from the community around you, and so it's night and day from jumping in a car with a bunch of strangers.
Yeah, it's like, and I don't want to ride with somebody I don't know.
Yeah, which is something that I think in a lot of communities, for example, here in Yavapai County, Yavapai Regional Transit, they actually just did a great video about one of their riders that kind of had those same, well, the bus isn't for me, but then once she started using it, she started to, build relationships with other riders on the bus, and it kind of becomes like a social, thing that she looks forward to all the time now, by just getting out in the community, interacting with her neighbors. So it's kind of cool that it has those opportunities as well.
So that, I didn't even think about that. Maybe just taking that first step on the bus.
Yeah, and there's one, and I forget where it was at, but there was some, kind of little promotional video I saw one time about how this couple, they actually had met on a bus, and so they kind of framed a whole little love story around how they were both riding public transportation every day to work, and finally they started to talk to each other. And so, not to say that's
not
cool, that's not the selling piece of public transportation, but it's those opportunities if you just look at kind of removing yourself, from just being in your car driving alone every day.
Well, and like you said, it's a form of isolation.
Yep, absolutely.
And we talk about social isolation all the time.
Yep,
aging.
big time. And so not only is the act of, actually riding the transportation, an opportunity to interact with the community, but just the opportunities it offers to go shopping, go to social events, volunteer opportunities, you name it. And we've talked a lot about, the issues of if somebody being isolated in their home and some of the detrimental health impacts. Well, all of a sudden you don't have a car. How are you going to get out? And so I think that's starting to be the direction I think we're going to move in Arizona a little bit more, is just recognizing that those needs are going to continue to grow. And so these rural areas are going to need to start looking in the public transportation direction.
So what are some of the other advantages of public transportation?
Well, I think that there's a lot of environmental supports, obviously.
Yeah.
I think that those are generally more appropriate and looked at when you're comparing the scale of a large city with the traffic and the congestion and all that. But it definitely has environmental impacts. But I think economic gains are a big thing as well, where access to jobs. Large employers are often kind of one of the biggest fans of public transportation, because it allows them to kind of expand their labor pool where they're searching for workers, because people can get to work on time and on reliable in a reliable fashion. And so the economic gains from both the workforce side of things, and as well as just people being able to access standard services that maybe allow them to continue to be independent before, if they some of those access points get cut off and they start becoming a little bit more reliant on social programs for support. And so I think it's a good way to kind of serve as a preventative measure.
A way to get to the doctor, way to
Yep.
get to the store,
Yep.
way to pick up food.
Job training.
Yeah.
You name it.
And we are having some workforce issues.
Yep.
So how do we get folks to get out there? So what are some transit activities that you're working on in our county here in Yavapai?
So I think Yavapai County is really interesting in that it's kind of the tale of two counties, and from a public transportation perspective. And so you have the central Yavapai area, the Prescott Valley, Chino, Mayor, Dewey, Humboldt, and then you have the Verde Valley. And so the Verde Valley has kind of before my time, but I think that they've been very proactive in seeing that public transportation is a real asset and a real tool, and so they've actually kind of invested and been able to build up a pretty substantial program out of that, out of Cottonwood, and then also extending into Sedona. And so it's interesting because people often think that the Verde Valley, well, that's even more, that's rural Yavapai County. Meanwhile, central Yavapai County kind of hasn't quite just jump in, with all hands on deck with public transportation. And so there's some initiatives that are taking place right now. We're actually working with SIMPO, which is the Central Yavapai Metropolitan Planning Organization, where they're conducting a transit implementation plan, where they're trying to figure out exactly not only kind of where would a public transportation system go, but what are some of those areas that maybe have stalled initiatives in the past in terms of kind of the governance structure, and how do we kind of get rally and get community support for something like this, because they kind of have a long documented history of seeing the need for it. Now it's time to see, well, what do we actually need to do kind of from a governance structure to actually make something like this happen.
And you've got you've got more government entities to deal with over here
Yep.
than we do in the Verde Valley.
Absolutely.
Cottonwood being the big entity. And over here we've got, 4 city governments.
Yep. That collaboration piece is huge, and it's very difficult. So.
It creates opportunities and challenges.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Yeah. But kind of keeping in Yavapai County, looking over into the Verde Valley, there's also a pretty exciting initiative up in Sedona, which, if you've been to Sedona recently or any weekend, the traffic's kind of unbearable. There's a lot of visitors. That's a community that really thrives off of tourism. But it's getting to the point now where it's almost becoming a detriment because people can't get around, whether it's people coming in from out of state and want to visit the natural amenities, or even locals. And so the city of Sedona is kind of also doing a very similar study where they're looking at creating a pretty rather robust public transportation system out of Sedona that's intended to really kind of help cater towards the visitors and reduce that congestion, but also provide opportunities for people to get in and around Sedona. And so those two initiatives kind of for Yavapai County really, from my point of view, are kind of, forcing some conversations around public transportation that I think need to be had. And I think that both studies have done a good job of just kind of talking to the communities and hearing, well, what are you tired of? What are some opportunities? And I think a lot of it's an education piece. What is your perceptions of public transportation? What does it mean? And kind of helping debunk some of the traditional myths or just maybe negative interpretations of public transportation, and seeing how it could actually become just a part of the community.
Well, and didn't you hold some, what did you call them, get on the bus?
Sure.
Little thing. I think that's a great idea. We should do that again.
And that's actually part of some work that we'll be doing is, continue that education and awareness, as well as, gathering feedback from people. We don't want to be forcing public transportation down, into Yavapai County, but we really feel like that's what we're hearing.
So what did you do that? So explain to our listeners what did you do? You met at the parking lot and
sure. So in a study we actually did in Coconino, Navajo, and Apache counties, we actually kind of just pulled. We worked with some of the local public transportation agencies and just brought a bus and parked them at a Walmart or a Saturday market, and just kind of opened up the doors and we had some flyers and things out front to kind of let people know what was going on. But then had people just kind of get on the bus and sit down and kind of see what it feels like. And it was interesting. I think a lot of people didn't realize that their communities actually even had a public transportation system. And so it was a really cool just to have a discussion in that setting to kind
Yeah.
of, take it out of a meeting room and actually get it out into the communities where the service is going to be, how it's going to be perceived.
Yeah. What's it look like? What's it feel like?
Yeah, exactly.
More hands-on. I thought that was
Yeah.
a great idea.
Yeah, meeting with the bus driver, because I think that, and that's another big thing is just kind of a timidness to, if even if public transportation is available, to how do I use this foreign thing? I know exactly how to go and start my car. I know how to do that process, but how do I go about accessing this different tool? And so I think that that's always kind of the first line of communication in public transportation is the bus driver. And a lot of agencies really make a considered effort to have friendly bus drivers that are kind of customer service people as well as bus drivers. There's always going to be a handful of bus drivers that are out there that they've been having a long hard day and they may not be as friendly, but I think that's the customer service piece is definitely something that's kind of inherent in the public transportation experience.
Yeah.
And so just the act of how do you get on the bus, how do you pay, where and how do I know when to get off and things like that. So the bus driver can help with that, but I think that technology is also becoming something that's that's kind of evolving with public transportation, where it's an initiative that I'm actually working on with a lot of the transportation providers in our region, where we're actually putting their route information into Google Earth. And so if how I figured out how to get here is I typed in on Google Maps, the directions. So now it will include a transit function as well, where it'll show you exactly where you would go to get on the buses, what times you could ride the buses, and so it's just another way of kind of increasing the accessibility of the services.
So if you got a smartphone, you can figure out the bus system.
Yep. Or if not, there's some resources like AAA's information referral that people could call into, and I'd like to have it set up. If once we get it all up and running, it's a tool that they could have to help people kind of maneuver.
Oh, yeah, we would absolutely make sure they had it. So they can call that toll-free number, 877-521-3500, and they can do that now and call. And I know that you make sure that they have an updated route sheet for the whole region. So if you don't know where to call for transportation now, that's the place to call.
Yeah.
And I think you go further than just public transportation. I mean, it's all public transportation, but we've been talking about buses. There's more.
Yep. No,
and there's more.
And I appreciate. I appreciate you kind of bringing that up. And that's the first thing I was going to talk about, because that's the first thing everyone kind of interprets. And I do think that having a healthy, what we call kind of traditional transportation system is imperative.
Yeah.
But kind of perfect example in the central Yavapai Valley is where you haven't had a traditional public transportation system, a robust one, the comprehensive one. Then you get a lot of kind of human service agencies that say, well, gosh, this is a huge need, and it fits loosely within our mission. But what we want to be able to serve our constituents, our clients, and so a lot of these human service agencies ultimately end up becoming little mini transportation providers, and so I think it's a really unique and cool thing to see, and I think it kind of ties back into our conversation about in the West. I think it's a pretty common thing that's happening in the West, across the board. But you have these human service agencies or senior centers or whoever, these kind of informal transportation services that have they have the passion and the desire to serve their clients or constituents, and so they provide the service. Kind of part of my job is to ensure that there's always a threat of kind of a duplication of services with all happening kind of sporadically, and so my job as well is to try to kind of again build a kind of coalition, a coordinating activities where those agencies can kind of work together with each other, because no one agency is going to be able to serve the entire region.
No.
And I think that there's been some great examples of what's taking place here in Yavapai County with that, with different agencies kind of sharing information, sharing resources, expanding the traditional maybe clientele group that they normally serve to serve the general broader public, because there's needs that are out there. And so it's all kind of about how do you maximize that passion, and also just those resources that are out there. It does no good to have a vehicle, passing up somebody that needs a ride if it's a 5-passenger vehicle and then there's one person on it. And so the costs are pretty minimal in terms of, just making the best use of those resources. But often there's hurdles with trying to get over some, again, kind of a siloed approach and just the traditional norms that agencies are dealing with.
Well, that takes a lot of diplomacy on your part.
It does, and time. I think it's
Yeah.
important, building trust, building kind of those relationships. And that's also not only with the agencies, but it's also with the individual, the riders on the end point. If my grandma is used to getting transportation from the senior center all the time, but the senior center, she lives just kind of outside of where they would really like to go. How does that relationship look like with another agency that comes and picks her up? How does she get used to something out of her kind of normal routine?
Her comfort zone.
Her comfort zone. And so
Yeah.
I think it all kind of comes back to the educational piece as well.
Right. And like you said, it doesn't do us any good to have a van with empty seats.
It never does good to have a van full of empty seats. And so kind of going back all the way to the beginning with my position is actually kind of an extension of ADOT. And so ADOT has really recognized that value of trying to maximize all the different resources and coordinating things. And so when they have different grant programs, that's something that they look for. Is an agency if I'm going to award a vehicle to this agency, well, how are they working with everybody else? Because
Right.
we don't want to be awarding a vehicle to an agency on this side of the street and then another vehicle to an agency on this side of the street if they're going to be doing similar things. And so it's all about how do you kind of spread out those resources to better serve the region.
And that's not as easy as it sounds.
No, it's not. It's not at all. It's not at all. There's a lot of work that goes into it, but again, I really appreciate that role, and I really like kind of serving in that. And so you get to meet a lot of great agencies that really have. I keep going back to their passion, but they're in it for the right reasons, and so it's great to be able to work with them and just kind of get creative. You have to get creative. When I was in Boise, I would always introduce myself in this mobility management role as I kind of try to MacGyver together solutions or transportation solutions. And so, it's not a shoelace and a toothpick putting together a service, but it kind of is. It's an agency here, it's an agency here. How can we all kind of build off the strengths of each other to provide more transportation?
And you're right. If they all have the passion and their heart's in the right place, that's a big hurdle right there. And then it's just getting over of the idea that they're my clients.
Yep, and that's a big piece, and it's understandable.
Yeah. Sure.
It's understandable for sure. But just being able to kind of lay out what it looks like from the rider's side is a lot of times, and I mentioned with my grandma, but with the right level of education on how the whole kind of thing works. A lot of times riders won't really care who picks them up. Once they've kind of become familiar, they care that they're getting from A to B.
Right.
And so how that's all kind of formatted and communicated is also a major point of my job.
Well, I think also too. Let's go back to the economics of the whole thing.
Sure.
Something that we're not used to having in the West is public transportation.
Yep.
I always marvel when I go back east for work that people don't have cars.
Yep.
They don't. Why?
Sure.
Because the public transportation is so robust, they don't need them. They have trains and subways and buses and trolleys, and they don't need cars. And so you have the expense of a car, the insurance you have to pay for the car, the maintenance you have to pay for the car, and a lot of seniors are on a very fixed income.
Sure.
And if we could have a more robust transportation system, they would save a lot of money.
They would, absolutely.
And so that part of that education, if we could.
Sure.
Do some comparisons on what it would cost to use the public. Once we get it there, here's how much it would cost you for the public transportation. Here's how much, it would cost you to keep a car.
Absolutely. And so there's ways that you can look at it kind of on the end user's standpoint, but then you can also look at, public transportation isn't cheap. It definitely is.
Right.
I mean, it costs money. You got to, pay a driver, and the reliability factor has to be there. So you have to have,
It's got to be there.
It's got to be there. You got to be paying, people for the hours that you're having a service open. But if you start looking at all those costs of public transportation, they can be kind of staggering when you first look at them kind of independently. But if you start looking at how much money is invested in roadways and, all the infrastructure that goes along with allowing us to move around, move around as we please, that feeling of independence, then it starts kind of framing in a different light. And so, that's another angle that we're looking to take, recognizing that, in the West, we don't want to, again, try to kind of push transportation if it's areas that it doesn't fit or at a
Right.
scale that it doesn't fit.
Right.
And so, recognizing that there's always going to be the competition between roads and public transportation. I think just being able to find kind of that happy medium in locations, and especially I think that looking at senior populations where those economic impacts, they extend, far and wide anywhere you look. If healthcare is a great example. So I don't, my grandma, again, she's not going to her healthcare appointments because she doesn't have, she's not driving anymore.
Not driving.
Well, it's costing the healthcare provider out of their pocket every time she doesn't show up to an appointment because she can't get there. And then, so say she kind of ignores, a health issue because she's not able to get to the doctor, and then all of a sudden she has to have an ambulance come to get her, for something more serious. And so, kind of looking at all the impacts of not being able to access services that are needed, I think is probably the kind of tagline for public transportation, the really rallying point, especially in rural areas. And so, and in rural areas, with the senior populations, it's the trends nationally are always kind of moving. But I ran across some interesting stats just in the last year so about 20% of the seniors throughout the United States are still living in rural areas. And 13% of those seniors don't have a car.
Wow.
And so, I mean, and without a car, then, okay, you're relying on family members. And again, talking about economic costs, what is it, what are all the costs that are taken out for me taking off work to go take my grandma around? And those things really start adding up.
Yeah.
And so, just hammering the education piece. And I think that with the Central Yavapai study, they're really doing a good job of kind of breaking down all those different factors and what does it mean to us on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's the beginning then. So, there's some opportunities for some public transportation in the future for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that just because there's no public transportation now doesn't mean that there's never going to be public transportation.
We got to start somewhere, right?
You got to start somewhere, and you got to recognize that it's going to take time.
Everything takes time.
Everything takes time, but I think that often with public transportation, I've seen enough times where, kind of on any level, whether it's kind of at a micro level or a macro level, success kind of generates more success. So if
Yes,
you're
it
able to get a
does.
little bit of, for example, with the coordination factor, with all these informal transportation providers, if you're able to start building some success there, then it can start lead to, okay, maybe there's opportunities for more robust systems.
We're lucky to have you as our mobility manager. You've got a lot going on.
Yeah, we do.
And I appreciate you working on it.
Yeah.
And I enjoy working with you as we move towards, hopefully some more public transportation in Yavapai College, Yavapai County. Tod Morris, our mobility planner for this entire region at NACOG. I thank you for being here.
Okay, thank
I
you.
appreciate it very much. And thank you for listening. This is Senior Moment, Successful Aging. I'm Mary Beals-Luedtka. Until next time.